Hello, and welcome to Medium in Conversation, a speaker series where we chat with fascinating people about some of the more urgent and interesting issues of the day. I'm Siobhan O'Connor, Medium's Vice President of Editorial. I run content strategy here, and I'm delighted to introduce you to someone who has become a very powerful voice on our platform and beyond during the pandemic. Um, I'll introduce her and then we'll kick it off. Tara Haelle is a science journalist, educator, and the author of many books, including Vaccination, Investigation, and The Informed Parent, both of which received critical acclaim for Tara's clear-eyed and scientifically rigorous approaches to topics that are subject to confusion and, let's face it, in some cases, outdated science and even in the wrong hands, misinformation. She's also a very popular contributor to Medium's health publication Elemental, which takes a science-backed approach to personal health and well-being. And since the beginning of the pandemic, her work on COVID really tracks the pandemic's progression. In the early days, she wrote about masks. She's written about social distancing when questions and, again, misinformation, confusion emerged around herd immunity. She was on that too. And then this summer, when many of us hit a collective wall, she familiarized millions of readers with the concept of mental surge capacity, explaining in a wildly viral essay that the human brain struggles to process the kind of stress wrought by the COVID-19 pandemic, and our reserves, quote unquote, had been depleted. Most recently, she published an epic piece that answers probably every question you could possibly have about the coronavirus immunization that, should you read it in one sitting, would take 61 minutes to complete. That's mostly what we're going to be talking about today. Tara, welcome to Medium in Conversation.
Hi, thanks for inviting me.
Great to have you. All right, let's get into it. At the end, we're going to go back and forth for about 45 minutes, and we will open it up to questions from registrants. So please drop those in the Q&A in the chat, and we will get to as many of them as possible. So let me set the table here. We're in the midst of both the worst pandemic in ages and the most ambitious emergency vaccine rollout in US history. Roughly 40 million doses have been administered in the US so far. 130 million, doses have been given around the world. 20 vaccines in phase 3 trials, 8 approved for limited use, 2 approved for full use, more on the way. There's a lot going on. And at the same time, strategies and tactics for vaccine distribution really run the gamut. Some states following CDC recommendations, some not. We've seen some blunders so far with slow rollouts, expired vaccines. I want to get a sense from you, what's going wrong? What's going right? And are you optimistic we're on the right track?
Ooh, that's not a loaded question at all, is it? Okay, so let me start with what's going right. Honestly, what's going right is the development of the vaccines. And I know that that's the part that's already happened. But I will tell you that when we were talking about vaccines or hearing the scientists talk about doing the vaccines way back in, the very beginning, March, April, and then, I think it was late spring, early summer when there was some uneasiness, like, is this going too fast? Or, are we going to have all the safety checks? There were a lot of questions. Experts had questions. And what I told people was, I'm just hoping that we have something that's at least as effective as the flu vaccine, which is our crappiest vaccine. Like that's not a high bar at all. When we ended up with 2 vaccines that are 95% effective at preventing any disease, 100% effective at preventing death and hospitalization, and we'll just stop right there. I was that was beyond my wildest dreams. We don't have very many vaccines at all that are that effective. And I'm talking about the ones that are 20, 30, 40 years old. There's very few vaccines that are 95 or higher. So I'm still kind of blown away when I sit and think about it. Like, oh my God, within 1 year, we discovered a virus, we sequenced it, we developed a vaccine, we tested it in 40,000 people in one trial, 30,000 people in another trial, which are the right sizes. We went through all the right, we did phase 1, we did phase 2, we did phase 3. It went through the subcommittee at the FDA, it went through the FDA, it went through the CDC. Holy crap. Like I've been covering vaccines for 10 years and I'm still blown away by that. So that's the biggest thing that we've done right. Of course, that's largely on the scientist end, but it's still something that was done right. What we're doing wrong? Well, we tried, I will say one thing they tried to do right was they tried to be as equitable and thoughtful as possible in determining who would get the vaccines first. And I heard so many great things from people working in terms of, wanting to reach underserved populations and equity, things like, don't have it near an immunization office, make sure that you don't have to sign up online. So there were all these grand plans, and I don't see any of that happening. The part that we're getting wrong is the allocation and the distribution, and it's something that it's not honestly that surprising. Those of us who are watching this for a long time, I kept seeing people worried about vaccine hesitancy, and I was like, I'm not worried about vaccine hesitancy. I'm worried about distribution. This is the largest infrastructure project in human history. Like, this is the largest vaccination campaign in human history. This makes the smallpox vaccination
Right.
campaign look like nothing because of the compressed time frame. And had we been under a different administration, I think there may have been some improvements. I don't know how much, because honestly, a lot of it's up to the states. So it would depend on how much the federal government could have put pressure on the states to have things in line. But I know from the H1N1 pandemic that the basic infrastructure for doing a large vaccination campaign did exist. It wasn't completely absent because that was put in place during the 2009, 2010 H1N1 epidemic. Whether, why that's not happening now, I don't know. I mean, the distribution is a mess. There's far too much reliance on computers to get appointments. The equity is shot. We see a bunch of white educated people getting the vaccines. I got the vaccine, and I'm glad I got the vaccine, and I did meet the requirements to get a vaccine. But I don't think I should have gotten a vaccine before many other people in my community that I wish could have gotten a vaccine, including grocery workers. I mean, I think that, even healthy grocery store workers should have gotten their vaccine before I did. And so I think that's where we're messing up the most. Am I optimistic? It's hard to say. We just changed administrations a couple weeks ago. I don't have a clear enough sense of how much pressure the federal government can put on. And it's a lot of it kind of, the horse left the barn, right? We've already started on the shaky start. I don't know how much of that can be fixed. I'm glad to see the journalism that's happening where people are pointing out the problems and saying, this shouldn't, there's been many articles talking about the digital divide, and I think that's good.
Right.
Whether that leads to change, I don't know. So it's hard for me to say if I'm optimistic. I mean, I'm optimistic that a lot of people are going to get vaccines, but right now I'm a little bit despondent that the right people aren't getting the vaccines and the underserved communities aren't getting the attention they need. So it's kind of a mixed answer, but I'm also kind of a perpetual optimist. It's in my blood.
Mhm.
So I can't be too pessimistic. I can be cynical, but I'm still optimistic because I don't know any other way to be.
I don't either. I'm also optimistic by nature, but there's a lot of stuff that you just said that I want to kind of like
Okay.
unpack
Yeah. There's a lot going on.
um and maybe just like dig in a little bit. Let's start with you mentioned you got the vaccine. I know you're in the Dallas Fort Worth area.
Mhm.
How are vaccines rolling out there, and what considerations, if any, did you take before getting the shot? I mean, it's interesting that people are being put in this position where if the vaccine is available to them, they're making sort of these bioethical decisions about whether or not they should get it before someone else because, hey, they've got a shot. How did you think that through?
Well, the way that it was done here, I live in Tarrant County, which is there's Tarrant County and there's Dallas County in terms of the Dallas Fort Worth Metroplex. There's a bunch of surrounding counties, but those are the two main central counties. And within Tarrant County, the city of Arlington, which is where my parents live, that city had a really well-oiled machine going really early on. You went online, you signed up, you got a call that said, okay, a call or an email or a text or all three, depending on what you opted into, saying, come between these hours tomorrow. You came, and it was really easy. It took a little while. It was about an hour wait total from arrival to getting the vaccine. But I wrongly assumed that that's how it was going a lot of other places. It wasn't until I started reading reports from other places that I realized, wow, we were really lucky. And
Wow.
people were asking me how I managed to get it. And I said, I think it was an accident of geography. I happened to live in a metro area where there happened to be a city that happened to be doing a good job.
Right.
And that's just dumb luck, right? I imagine, I don't know that this is true, but I've hypothesized that because Dallas Fort Worth is such a huge metro, we're the fourth largest metro area in the US. So maybe there were a lot of vaccines coming this way because of that, but that's purely, speculation. I don't know.
Right.
In terms of my decision to get it, I knew that I met the requirements because I have 4 different comorbid conditions that put me at higher risk. My husband also has 5 conditions actually that put him at higher risk. And with both of us being at higher risk and knowing that the variants are going around, we have 2 children and we've been staying locked down as much as we can, but there's still things that happen now and then where, the groceries get dropped off or someone comes to the door and you have to tell them to go away. You can't be 100% positive. You can't protect yourself 100% no matter what you're doing. And for me, it was, well, do I want to take the risk of leaving my children as orphans? Because my husband and I have a very high likelihood of dying if we get this.
Right.
So for me, that was the calculation. Now, that said, if I could have nominated someone to get it in, if I could have said, okay, I'm going to put it off for 2 weeks so person A can get it. Okay, I'm going to put it off another week so person, I would have done that. In fact, I would have done it for my sister, who is far healthier than me, but is teaching face to face in person in high school
Wow.
and she can't get it yet. So, I agree with what we're seeing from a lot of the bioethicists, which is if you can get a vaccine, get it. Just because the more vaccines that get into the arms as possible, the less vectors there are passing it around. And the idea is to get it to everybody eventually. So just because you don't get it doesn't mean that someone who needs it more does get it. And that's the thing. You can't do sub-ins, right? I can't show
Right.
up with a, what do you call that? Is it a pitch hit? What is a pitch hitter or whatever? You know what I mean?
I think that's right. I'm not good on sports metaphors either.
I should avoid the baseball analogies, but you can't nominate, you can't show up and say, hi, I qualify for the vaccine, but this nice lady here who works at the local Kroger, she needs it more than it doesn't work that way. So in given those facts, it would have been foolish for me not to get it, right?
Absolutely.
Do I feel bad that I could get it when others didn't? Yes, I do. Can I do anything about that? No, I can't do anything more about that than I could about a whole bunch of other stuff that's been going on for the last 4 years. So you do what you can. And, what I did do was I tried to help other people find the information.
Right.
So, and in fact, one of my dad's friends is he's got cancer right now, stage 3 or stage 4 throat cancer, and he was trying to get information, and he's in a different county, but I was helping him through it and giving him information and walking him through it, and I made it clear to people online on Facebook, if anyone has any questions, let me know. And I did get questions, so I tried to help other people, and that was kind of the most I could do in sort of offering the information.
One of the through lines in your work, we've talked about this, is even in the face of despair and very, very difficult things like the surge capacity story, you do have this through line of helpfulness. So it's awesome to see that play out in your own life too when you got that. Tell
I
us
tried.
about, you got the second shot last week.
Right.
What was that like? Side effects?
Well, first of all, for people who don't already know this, that's why this was put off a week, because I found out on, I think it was Friday afternoon, that I was going to be given it on Monday morning. And I knew that there was, I tell people, prepare for the second shot. Assume for the second shot, whether it's Moderna or Pfizer, assume that you're going to have a fever, chills, you're going to throw up, and you're going to have a headache, and you're going to feel like crap, and you want to stay in bed for 2 days. And then if you don't, hey, that's a bonus, right? And that's what I was doing. I was assuming that. And that's why I called you guys and said, we might want to put this off. What do we do? I originally told one of the editors, I said, well, I've done crazy things before when, I taught a class 2 days after a postpartum hemorrhage. So maybe I can do this with a fever. Fortunately, we didn't do that. I did not develop a fever, but my arm was really sore. I did have a headache, sort of a low grade background headache, not like a super intense headache. But the biggest thing was this sense of sort of, I was definitely fatigued, and I had this sort of fuzziness, which
Mhm.
was, if you know how when you have a head cold, if you imagine having a head cold without the actual congestion, but with the way the congestion feels in your head, if that makes, it's like your head feels heavy. And it's not that you can't think, you can, but everything's just sort of slower and distorted or something. That's the main thing that I remember. Just kind of feeling out of sorts. So, but I mean, I had it pretty good. My husband had a low grade fever and chills. He spent the day in bed, but we both felt fine the day after that. So I feel like I got away with it pretty well.
Not too bad. And so just to go back to something that you said earlier, the recommendation really is that if you are up in line for a vaccine, you should get it.
Basically, yeah. I mean, that doesn't mean jump the queue. I mean, that doesn't mean go
Of
and
course.
lie and say, I have type 2 diabetes. I should be in line. You should be honest about whether you actually meet the current qualifications. In our case, Texas had begun vaccinating people who had, they were either 65 and older or who were under 65 but had a pre-existing condition that increased the risk of COVID complications or death. So, definitely make sure you're following the rules. But I don't think that trying to second guess yourself over whether you should or shouldn't is helpful. And it kind of makes me angry that we're even in that place, because the CDC's guidelines were supposed to stop that from happening. We shouldn't really be put in a situation where we feel like we're having to make these ethical decisions that we're not equipped to make. We're not ethicists. So,
Yeah, absolutely. Every health expert with any real sort of credibility will say that the response in the US and elsewhere was a disaster, frankly, in the early days. And while every virus behaves slightly differently, there are sort of pandemic playbooks that the US did not follow. How
absolutely.
much of a difference do you think we would be if we had acted sooner? And like, where do you
Wow.
place the onus of responsibility?
Well, the onus of responsibility is easy, 100% on the federal government, because not only, first of all, the federal government could have activated the Defense Production Act much sooner and gotten a lot. We could have. Why doesn't every house have an N95 mask right now? That could have been possible. That was 100% possible. It's not, because the Defense Production Act wasn't created, or wasn't activated. Excuse me. The biggest thing, though, was in the very beginning. I think this is my biggest frustration, and it may be the frustration of a lot of the epidemiologists, is that it was never clearly communicated why we were locking down and what we were supposed to do with that lockdown. Because we had that lockdown in March, and honestly, I was impressed. The United States, I did not expect the compliance that we got. The whole nation locked down and stayed that way for, I don't know, what was it, maybe 3 or 4 weeks before the protests started. And that should have been the purpose of that was to ramp up testing, get tests everywhere they needed to be, and implement contact tracing, which is exactly what Australia did. And Australians are now able to go out and eat without masks and don't have to worry about the virus, because they used the lockdown for what it was supposed to be for.
Right.
The problem is here, because none of that happened, people think a lockdown is just to delay the inevitable. And I don't blame them for thinking that, because they have no reason to think otherwise. So it's no wonder that there's this strong anti-lockdown belief, because they don't understand what the purpose of it is, what the value of it is. They don't see how it could actually get the pandemic under control. There's no political leverage to do that anymore. Even if Biden was able to somehow miraculously make a bunch of state governors enforce that, there's just no buy-in. We can't do it. We've lost that window. So that's the biggest thing that we lost. In addition to that, then, I think, is the fact that the federal government did not extend the relief that was necessary to let people stay home. So you can't tell every restaurant to close and send every single restaurant worker home and give them $2,000 for the next 9 months and say, have a great day. You need to actually give them money they can live off during that time. And there is no reason. I mean, look at our defense budget. I don't even need to get into it. We easily could have given the money that was necessary. Again, Australia did that, and look where Australia is. The third thing is setting the national tone in terms of the non-pharmaceutical interventions. NPIs are actually the best way to reduce your risk of the disease. And without having a national leader who was, who actually modeled the behavior that was necessary to reduce that risk and really emphasize that message, you ended up with a very politically polarizing message where a large proportion of the country didn't see the value of masks or social distancing. And that continues to this day, and it's still a big issue to this day. Americans, in my opinion, have a tendency. Someone used this, Caitlin Kelly, a New York Times writer, mentioned this on Twitter, and I love the way that she said it. If you're familiar with the marshmallow test, Americans failed the marshmallow test. Now, the marshmallow test is actually a problematic study. There's a whole other issue about that. But even if you take it at face value, we failed the marshmallow test, which is we couldn't wait until later. And yet, the same problems with the original marshmallow test, the fact that you can't expect low-income kids to wait for a marshmallow when they don't know when they're gonna be getting it or not, is also true in the United States. We failed the marshmallow test because a whole huge part of our population couldn't sit at home and wait. They needed food, they needed to eat.
They
And
needed
then we
to
had
work,
sort of the entitled ones.
right?
But, when it comes to classic disease control, your non-pharmaceutical interventions, your NPIs, your mask wearing, your social distancing, those are the gold standard. And I think Americans are a little bit too used to wanting to do their own thing, freedom, blah, 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 and they want technology to save them. The vaccine will save them. And the problem is the vaccine by itself can't save us. Technology is, you can't technology your way out of a pandemic. Behavior is what drives change. But because we didn't have that model and that message at the very beginning on behavior, I don't think it's really possible to get it now. So those were, I could go on and on and on, but how's that for a start?
I mean, it's so interesting because there's two things that I was going to ask you to kind of unpack here. So on the one hand, we saw with the last administration what I would call like a sort of assault on science, and at the same time, and this sort of just erosion of confidence in science. And then at the same time, we saw remarkable progress, as you said at the top, with rapid vaccine development and like really great vaccines. And then on the other hand, you have, sort of NPI aversion, like experts agree that any mask is better than no mask. And yet there's still a lot of people who are going around maskless, and obviously leaders of the country at times going around maskless. How do you, but I guess what I'm hearing from you is it's not really so much about science versus not science. It's about like magic bulleting our way out of a pandemic
Yeah,
versus
well, it's about, first of all, it's about leadership. I mean, you need, any kind of disaster requires leadership, and every disaster in history, we know that. I mean, we can look at every disaster that's happened in history, natural or man-made. Leadership is what makes or breaks our response to it and our ability to get out of it or recover from it. And we did not have the leadership that we needed, and that trickled down because it led to, there were state governors who were split on what to do. That should never have happened. There should never have been a split there. But there was, because of the way that everything was politicized. I will say that if I have to say one thing the administration did right, no matter what, was throwing a whole lot of money at the vaccines. That was a good decision. I'm not surprised by the decision because the values of the people in that administration tend to be the industry type. They tend to be the money will solve my problems type, and they tend to be the I don't care about my behavior, I'll do what I want type. So in a way, the national response as a whole, if we look at everything together, mimicked exactly what we saw in Washington, which was I'll do whatever I want behavior, but I'll let the vaccine save me because technology will get me out of this. And now I say that it's a little unfair for me to say that because I do think the vast majority of people were following the recommendations. The problem is with a pandemic, it only takes the few that aren't to hurt the rest of us. So even though I do think the majority of the Americans, even the majority of the Americans who supported the former administration, were actually wearing masks and trying to stay home, again, they didn't have the support for staying home. And I go back and forth between getting angry at the person who won't wear a mask and then thinking, well, but not knowing anything about that person's background, how much can I blame them when they're part of this group that's been sort of brainwashed into thinking that? And I go back and forth on that because it's like, okay, personal responsibility, but brainwashing, but so it's frustrating because there's no excuse for not having had that leadership.
Absolutely. Speaking of leadership, so COVID-19 recently surpassed heart disease as the at least current leading cause of death in the US. Heart disease has been the number one killer for a very long time. President Biden has set a goal of getting 100 million doses in the first 100 days of his administration. What I want to know from you, going back to what I sort of was talking about at the top, like around herd immunity, right? I've seen experts estimate that we need anywhere from like 70, 90% of the population to be inoculated, either because they got it or because they got vaccinated, to get to herd immunity. I don't even know if that's true. There is just so much confusion around this. And then now we've got vaccines and variants in a sort of race. How do you help the public make sense of that?
It's hilarious that you even asked that because I was going to talk to a certain editor at your publication about revisiting the idea of herd immunity in an article. Like, let's go back and look at this again because I wrote about it early in the pandemic. I think one thing people don't realize about herd immunity is that it's dependent on a lot of different factors. It's not this magic number. You can't just pull a number out. For one thing, it depends on it is relevant what NPIs are being engaged in. So if you're in a state or in a county where mask compliance is very high, herd immunity is going to arrive faster than a place where the mask compliance is very low because it's continuing to spread while you're getting vaccinated.
Mm.
So there, there's things that go on during the vaccination process that can affect how long it takes you to get to that point. Another thing to consider is that we're going to be having different vaccines. The Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines, those are both 95% effective. The AstraZeneca vaccine is kind of all over the place, to be honest. It's somewhere between 60 and 85-ish. The Johnson and Johnson vaccine looks about 85% against any type and about 100% against hospitalization or death. I can't remember where Novavax was. I think it's in this, I don't even want to guess because I don't remember offhand, but each of those has a different threshold for how much they're able to prevent the disease. And we don't know yet about transmission. Now, that doesn't mean I've heard some people get confused and think that, oh, well, you can still get the vaccine and you can still get the virus and pass it on even if you're vaccinated. Not necessarily. It's quite possible that you can't. We just don't know that yet. We don't have the data to say you do. We don't have the data to say we don't. So for safety's sake, let's assume for now that you might pass it on, even though it's not likely. All of those are going to go into that calculation. I think, I mean, just based on things I've seen from Dr. Fauci and others, the 70 to 85% range vaccination is probably a reasonable estimate. I'm not a biostatistician, so I'm not qualified to make that estimate myself. However, I'll be honest, and this is where I'm not so optimistic. I don't know if we're going to reach herd immunity with this. I don't know if we're going to, I don't know if we're ever, I think we might be stuck with COVID. And I think
What does
that the
that
rest
mean? Forever?
meaning, I think, if we consider how fast we need to vaccinate to outrun the variants, I don't know if we're going to ever be able to get rid of COVID completely in such a way that we might have if we'd been able to act faster and more as a global community in the beginning. And I think the United States is a big part of that. I mean, the rest of the world's going to get infected because we're so bad. But for once, it's not just the United States, right? I mean, the infections are out of control in Italy. They're out of control in Brazil. The UK is having a heck of a time. China did pretty well with it, to be honest. Most of the Far East did really well because they are communal type societies where looking out for other people is baked into their cultural ideology a lot more strongly than it is in this sort of more independent, freedom oriented Western ideas. So I think that we're going to have COVID for a while. I think the best thing that we can hope for is that something happens similar to the flu, where we become, our bodies adapt to it through multiple exposures between the combination of exposure and vaccination, so that it's simply not as severe. And we still have high mortality like we do with the flu, but it's not like it is right now, basically. That's my hope.
Right.
But I don't think we're getting rid of it. And I am also to counter that with some optimism. The fact that the mRNA platform relies simply on having the right mRNA, sequencing means that we can adapt very quickly to new variants. And so that's nice. But I don't think any of us wants to go and get a vaccine every 2 years either. So, we don't want to be, we don't want to be playing defense, but we already have been. So I don't know if that answers your question or not.
It does. It does. I mean, it's complicated, but you're adding a lot of nuance. So given that there are going to be multiple safe and effective vaccines with like a real spread on reported effectiveness, two questions it raises for me. What should should the average person be like trying to get the one with the best data so far? Do you get the one that's made available to you? Number one. And number two, which is more of a policy question, is what should happen, if anything, about how these different agents are being distributed? If one is far and away superior to the others, should that change the plan?
So the first one, I think it depends on what your personal risk, what your exposures are and what your risk threshold is. What I mean by that is I work from home and I do have very limited exposure. I have the ability and the privilege to be able to work from home and stay relatively free of most exposures. If I had the option, let's go to the marshmallow test. If I had the option to get AstraZeneca tomorrow or wait a month and get the Pfizer or Moderna vaccines, I'd probably wait because those have a higher effectiveness. However, if I were a grocery store worker, if I were a cashier who had to go to work every day, and even though I'm wearing masks and my coworkers are wearing masks, I'm exposed to all these people coming in every day. I'd get whatever I could as fast as I could.
Right.
So I think it really depends on where you fall in terms of your risk and your threshold. And it's going to be a very personal decision. I mean, for the most part, the biggest goal with the vaccination is not dying or ending up with the long-term complications. All of the vaccines so far prevent that. It's
Great.
just a matter of whether you have the flu-ish version of COVID or the more, or no COVID at all.
Right.
All of them currently have shown that they prevent death and, super severe hospitalization. And that's the most important thing. So in that regard, if I were exposed to other people, if I were a healthcare worker, I'd take whatever I could get. If I were a grocery store worker, if I were a teacher, I'd take what I could get. If I'm staying at home and I have the option to hang out for a bit and wait, then I might do that. So that's my answer to that one. The question of what we do is kind of similar. I think the goal is to get as many vaccines and as many arms as possible. And if having multiple vaccines that all prevent hospitalization and death are a way to do that, I don't think it should change anything in our policy. That said, this is America. We're very capitalist driven, and I expect the market's going to take care of that for better or for worse. Our public policy has a tendency to follow the market more than the science. So it might be an academic question.
Hilarious. You mentioned earlier, and I've read you sort of predicting vaccine hesitancy, that it wouldn't be as much of a thing as maybe we worried earlier in the pandemic. Do you think it's sort of a two-part question? It's like, A, do you still think that's true? And then I think another question that I get frequently asked, and I think a lot of people just ask themselves, is what is the most effective way to have conversations with people who are not, crazy, like anti-vaxxers, quote unquote, but just like there is a hesitancy perhaps for good historical reasons or whatever, lack of information. What's the best tack that you've either experienced or seen research to support?
First, I think we need to distinguish between the vaccine hesitancy that we are seeing with the COVID vaccines and the vaccine hesitancy that we used to see and still probably do, but it's not in the forefront right now, with childhood vaccines. The vaccine with childhood vaccines is usually, it's almost entirely a factor of misinformation.
Mhm.
Misinformation and disinformation drives it almost entirely. And there are still lots of people who have some hesitancy, and then they talk to their doctor or they get some information and they feel comfortable with it. Vaccine hesitancy with the COVID vaccine is much more, it has its roots in many more places, one of which is it's a brand new vaccine. And it's a lot more, not that childhood vaccination hesitancy is not understandable, but it's even more understandable to say this is a brand spanking new vaccine. I'm going to have a lot more questions about it. So I think it's perfectly reasonable, even right now, even with having had, experts on TV saying it's safe, it's effective. I'm saying it's safe, it's effective. Well, that's fine, but I can understand. It's totally someone in my family was saying, "Well, I don't know if I want to get it yet because of this." And they said, "Don't lecture me." And I said, "I'm not going to lecture you." I said, "I understand why you don't want to. If you have any questions, let me know." And that's all I did, because that person's going to need to take their time to get to the point where they can ask those questions. So I think the fact that the reasons are even more understandable make a difference. And I think we need to have some patience with people who have those questions because they're reasonable questions. The reason I said I don't think that hesitancy is going to be an issue in the beginning, and I still think that, we saw the huge anti-vax rally. Well, it wasn't huge, but we saw the anti-vax rally at the Dodger Stadium, and that got a lot of play. Those are the anti-vaxxers. Those aren't the vaccine hesitant people. Those are the nutcases. Those nutcases are always going to be there. Okay. I mean, I don't know if it's ableist for me to use that term, but those are the totally off the deep end, off the rails people. They've always been there. They're always going to be there. We don't need to give them any more oxygen than they already have. They don't represent the national mood, and they never will. They never have, and they never will. So I don't really count them, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
I don't engage with them, you know? I engage with the people that they're talking to, and that's what I think is more important. I do think we are going to reach a point where vaccine hesitancy can become a hindrance to reaching a high level of, immunization coverage. I don't think that's going to happen for at least a year because the demand is so high right now that the bigger issue is getting it into arms. The
Right.
people who want it can't get it. So I don't think we should worry about the people who don't want to get it yet because there's too many people who do, and that's where our focus should be. Once we do reach that point, how we engage with those people is first making them feel heard, listening to them. Don't mock them, don't shame them, don't say, "Oh, you're so stupid, you don't believe in science." Ask them, first make it a safe place for them to ask questions. Make them feel like it's okay for them to have those doubts and to ask those questions, and then find out what those questions are and ask them if they ask, "Do you want my help in looking at those answers, or do you want to find them on your own?" Keep the agency in their court. Otherwise, they're going to feel like they're being lectured to, and nobody likes that. Um, when they do have those questions, say, "Well, I found this information. Is this a source that you trust?" If they don't trust the CDC, then giving them all the pages in the world from the CDC aren't going to help them, right? What kind of sources do they trust? Okay, then look at those sources. It's all about letting them direct the conversation. It's a lot like therapy, to be honest. If you think about what you're, I don't know how many people have been in therapy, but I imagine a lot of us have, especially this year. And if you think about what your therapist does, your therapist never tells you what to do, even if you want them to tell you what to do, right? They
No, they
always
help
make
you
you
find the
come up with
answers.
what you have to do. They lead you in that direction. That's what you want to do. Not that we're all trained therapists, but they need to feel like they're in control. And they should be in control. It's their health. They need to feel like they have the agency to get all the information that they need. They need to feel comfortable asking those questions and getting that information and feeling comfortable with the answers that they get. That's what your place is. It's to facilitate that journey, not to lecture them, not to make fun of them, not to make them feel as though they have stupid questions.
I love the distinction that you make between vaccine hesitancy and anti-vaxxers. It's so important because the concerns that people have, particularly being first, being early, given historical precedent, and also just discomfort with that, like it's human. It's human.
Right.
Um,
There's one thing I want to add in here that is kind of interesting. I know that there's a lot of hesitancy in certain cultural groups, and I know one of those cultural groups is Black Americans, and a lot of Black Americans have cited I can never say it right, Tuskegee experiment for a reason that they're uneasy. Something that's kind of an interesting and ironic parallel is that the Tuskegee experiment was not about giving bad treatments to the Black men who had syphilis. It was about denying them treatment. They did not get the treatments they deserved and that they should have had. And there's a huge irony in the idea that a lot of people are uneasy about getting it because of stories like that. In a way, that's causing history to repeat itself in that Black Americans are not getting the vaccines that they need and deserve right now because of that history of distrust. And I can't, I totally understand that, but I think there's a sad irony there in that simply the misinformation about what the Tuskegee experiment has been, is itself a barrier.
Interesting. Changing tack for a moment. So a registrant, we've got a bunch of questions that have come in, so I'm going to start
Okay.
turning to them.
Okay, cool.
One registrant had a question that actually builds on something I was going to ask you as well. I have a 3-year-old son, and we just learned that his school will be mandating vaccines for all staff and students once it is available. So sort of a two-parter. What's your sort of take on mandated vaccines? And then do we know anything about the status of pediatric vaccinations?
In terms of pediatric vaccinations, I know the Pfizer and the Moderna trials are already looking at younger teenagers. Tweens, 11 to, 11 to 16 and 11 to 17 or 15. And once they have the data from that, they're going to go younger. So I think we're on track for that. There's not, I can't really say anything more than the fact that I'm comfortable with the fact that they're taking their time and on track with that. And I think it was reasonable for them to focus on adults first, given the differences in age and morbidity and what, how serious the disease is. Mandated vaccines. It depends on what you mean by mandate. There's, in one sense, depending on how you look at it, there's no such thing as a mandated vaccine in the United States unless you're in the military, which is to say no one's going to force you to sit down and stick a needle in your arm without your permission. Now, that said, there are consequences that may not be palatable to you, meaning I lose my job if I don't do this. So it's not mandated in the sense that they're going to force you down and do it, but you'll lose your job if you don't, which is adequate for an adequate motivator. I tend not to be a fan of mandates. I was not a huge fan of the way that the mandate law with schools in California went. I had some issues with the way the law was written, which people who wrote that law know about. And I think there have been some problems with that implementation. The only place that I think requiring people to get vaccines or else facing taking leave from their job is in healthcare professions. I think if you are a healthcare provider who has direct patient contact, if you are a nurse, a doctor, a respiratory therapist, physician's assistant, any of those individuals, I think they should be getting the vaccine. And if they're not going to get the vaccine, I think they shouldn't be seeing patients. That's pretty much the only profession where I think that's the case. I don't see a lot of value in requiring teachers to get the vaccines. I hope most teachers will get the vaccines, but I think carrots work a lot better than sticks in these kinds of situations. And similarly, I don't think that mandating a vaccine for childhood attendance in the schools is going to be helpful because, first of all, it is true that this disease does not kill a lot of kids. I mean, yes, kids have died from it, but kids are the best off of all the different groups. And so requiring that on pain of being dismissed from school with such a new vaccine and understanding people's concerns about that. We tried that once before with HPV and it did not go over well. It actually slowed, it backfired. It caused the HPV vaccination progress to slow down because people suddenly got suspicious of the vaccine. So I'm not people are often surprised when they hear me say that. They think I'm a mandate, pro mandate. I'm not personally. And that's not based just on opinion. It's also based on data. It's looking at, how people respond when they're put in a situation where you're forced to do something. Nobody likes to be forced to do anything. So yeah, I don't think it would advance our public health goals of getting as many people vaccinated as quickly as possible to mandate them. I just don't think it helps.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. All right, here's another question. How does this vaccine distribution compare to the Spanish flu distribution? At the time, there was an electronic aspect, but it was still accomplished. Smaller population, but distribution was completed.
I didn't think we had a vaccine with the influenza, did we? I didn't think we had a vaccine for that.
Not that I know of, but I don't.
Yeah, we didn't have a vaccine for the Spanish flu. The first, now I want to Google this. The first flu vaccine was approved, I think, in the 40s. No, 1938. Yeah, the first vaccine was 1938. So there was no distribution. That's why one of the reasons why the death toll was so high. There's a lot of reasons why it was so high, but that was one of the big reasons, is that they didn't have any options besides NPIs. And we actually very narrowly avoided another pandemic of the flu in 1958. And this man named Maurice Hilleman, who was he was a scientist at Merck. He developed more vaccines than any other scientist in the history of humanity. He single-handedly saved us from a pandemic in 1958. He saw he was the one who discovered how flu vaccines mutate and the different types of mutations, the difference between something called antigenic shift and drift, which I won't bore you with the details at the moment, but he saw that there was an antigenic shift, which is bigger than a drift. And he saw what kind it was. He made the vaccine. He told Merck to push it out. They did, and we avoided a pandemic because of it.
Wow.
but that was later. So
Judging by the nature of some of the questions, I actually think it would bore the registrants for this particular talk.
Well, I don't want to, I mean, I could talk about this stuff for hours, but I will say that the CDC has a great page explaining flu vaccine drift and shift, antigenic shift and drift. So check it out.
Someone would like to know at the moment, how do you address people who you encounter who are not wearing a mask or their mask is below their nose?
Well, let's see. When I went to Kroger one time and a man didn't have a mask, who it turned out was going to be an employee there, I said, "Excuse me," to the person who worked there and said, "This gentleman over here does not have a mask," and just walked in. And the manager said, "Oh, yes." And she went over and told him to put it on. And then I walked in and I saw two people in line who did not have masks. I said very loudly, "And these two individuals don't have masks either. Did you forget your masks? I can go get," and the woman looked very apologetic, who I assume was probably her grandson, said, "Yes, we don't have ours." And she said, "I'm sorry, we forgot." And I said, "Well, I have some extra masks in my car. I'm happy to go and get them for you." And she didn't know what to say. And the boy said, "I think we'll be okay." And I was like, I'm not gonna fight this battle. But when I go through a drive-through, I have told more than one drive-through person, I've said, "Excuse me, please put your mask back over your nose. I don't feel safe when you have it down below your nose." I did go through one drive-through and tell them that I had seen through the windows that they did not have their mask on when they weren't in front of the window, and that I was therefore not going to be ordering from them and would be watching in the future. So I am your worst enemy on that one. I am that person. I am the one who does not keep my mouth shut. Now, there was one time I kept my mouth shut when I went to go get the vaccine. There was an older man who was, oh my gosh, he was probably in his 80s, and the vaccine was the mask was right here, and it looked like it was very intentionally pulled there. And I thought, the odds that this man has COVID are very low. He's in a line for the second shot of the vaccine, not the first shot. And he's this old man. And, it's quite possible that he has some condition that really does make it harder for him to feel like breathing. I'm not going to say anything to this guy. And he was the only one. So I'm not a complete biatch about it, but I am the one who will, I'll say over the nose, or, I'll make it clear that you need, and I adjust it to the situation. So, but I do address it. I do address it pretty much every time I see it.
For people who have had COVID, if you've had COVID and presumably you have antibodies and you get access to a vaccine, what would be your advice? Same as above, I'm assuming. We sort of covered this.
I think so. I mean, I think if you've had it within the last 90 days, the CDC says you can wait, because we know that the risk of being reinfected in those first 90 days is extremely low. At the same time, if you have the opportunity to come up and you don't know when the opportunity is going to come up again, you might want to get it before they run out, because you don't know when it's going to come through again. So as long as you qualify and you meet the qualifications for whichever group is going, I would say to go ahead and get it, unless you are truly a homebody staying at home and you've already had it. It's a personal decision, but ultimately we do want everybody vaccinated, including the people who have already had it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So there's a whole bunch of questions coming in. We only have a couple more minutes, but my husband and I have been vaccinated. When can we hug our grandkids and hang out maskless indoors?
That one's really tough. I know that Elemental has a story coming on that soon from a really fantastic science journalist, Melinda Winter-Moyer, who's amazing. So watch for that article, because I know she'll do a great job at it. If you are vaccinated and someone else is vaccinated, I think it's easy. I'd say you can hug. If you both had your both doses and it's been 2 weeks since your last dose. Kids, it gets more complicated. Are the kids in virtual school and staying at home?
Right.
You didn't hear me say this, but I'll probably let my kids hug their grandparents, because we're vaccinated. My parents are vaccinated. My kids are in 100% virtual school. That's technically against what the CDC would tell you, but I'm human, if your kids are if our kids were in school right now, if they were in a situation where they were in school, I would not have them hug my parents, even though my parents have been vaccinated. So I think it's going to come down to a lot of personal risk threshold again. Keep in mind the different things that, we don't know how much it protects against the variants. We know the variants are circulating in the US. You may or may not know if they're in your area or not. I know both of them are in my area. Yeah. So you have to consider that. It's such a hard decision. And again, I wish that we had better guidance on it. I think that we need better guidance than what we have. The CDC's taken a very blunt approach to that, which is unfortunate. I think a lot of it, again, I'm sort of hedging here. It comes down to, I think, your personal risk threshold, but it's hard.
Yeah, I mean the introduction of the variants, they're in New York as well, where I live, and the introduction of the variants seems to be changing people's risk appetite for risk in real time. I know
Yeah.
a number of people who had COVID who were they weren't fancy free, they were doing all the right things, wearing
Right.
masks.
But they were a little bit more relaxed.
They were a little more relaxed, and now it's like the sort of
Yeah.
the
Well, and I
nerves
think
are up
the
again.
the higher transmissibility is the issue,
Yeah.
because the fact that they're more transmissible. We don't know if they're necessarily more severe, but at least they're more transmissible. That complicates everything. So, and not knowing, again, the vaccines, as far as we can tell so far, it does appear that at least the UK variant, maybe the South African variant, that one's a little bit up for grabs. It appears to prevent severe disease, if not completely preventing it. But there's just so much we don't know. And that the thing is, the variants are also complicated because we're going to keep having variants. We're kind of in a race against the variants right now. And the things that we're seeing happening with more governors opening up restaurants, with more schools pushing to open, that's going to make it worse. That's going to speed up the variants. So I'm frustrated to see that. It's when you finally have a tool that can be really effective that people are willing to get, that's not when you let your guard down. That's when you redouble your efforts, and we're not doing that.
Right. Okay, here's a science one. Is there a way the mRNA vaccine can introduce a variation of the spike protein of SARS-CoV-2 that confuses the immune system? I have this fear that an mRNA vaccine can create an autoimmune-like situation if the wrong protein is introduced.
I love that question because the person asking that question knows what they're talking about. They do understand the vaccine. It's not a ridiculous fear. It's the exact question I asked early on when I learned how the vaccine worked. That was my exact question. The answer is that no, it doesn't, because there's not enough of your cells making enough of them. There's only a couple. The vaccine goes in, you only have so many of the little tiny liquid nanoparticles that contain that mRNA. They go into X number of cells. Those cells produce and release the spike protein, and then it's done. They don't keep making it. It's not like it's an assembly line, right? They just make some of them and then they release them and then they're done. And then the body goes and sees those and makes the antibodies against it, but they don't make antibodies against the cell that produced it. So because they're not making antibodies against the cell that produced it, you don't have a situation where the immune system is attacking your body's cells. All it's attacking are the little, the proteins itself. Or if it does attack the cell, like I think some of them, I want to be careful because I don't want to overstep here. There could be some situations where the macrophages go and eat the cell, but only the cell that made it, and not any other cells that have the ability to make it. So the bottom line is there's an end. It doesn't keep going and going and going and going. And because it has an end, just like regular vaccines do, where they make enough antibodies to where it's under control. Okay, it's under control now. It's done. If you were continuously, injecting yourself every single day with mRNA, I don't know. That's a very different question. That could be a whole, who knows what would happen then. But because there's a finite number of mRNA, and the mRNA itself degrades very quickly. Once the instructions are gone, once they burn up, they're gone. The cell doesn't just keep going. Mm-hmm. So,
okay,
it's a very good question.
Very good question. We have a couple of related questions that have to do with, there's one question about whether or not the vaccines work on the variants. I think that's an open question, depends on the vaccine. There's also a number of questions around if you have underlying health conditions, if you've recently undergone like surgeries, that kind of thing.
Whether you should get the vaccine or... Okay, so the variants question, I will tell you, I actually was just today doing a lot of research on that because we're about to update our Q&A on that. So if you give this a couple more days, we'll have that update on our Q&A. We do have some data on that. We don't have everything we want, but we do have some. The question of who should not get the vaccine. I will say that my husband is on Humira, which is an immunosuppressant drug. It's a biologic that a lot of people, it's similar to the kinds of biologic drugs that people on cancer take. He got the vaccine. He clearly responded to it since he got fever and chills. And nobody in the clinical trials had was someone who was on immunosuppressant medication. So he's in one of those very, very rare groups where there is no data, like pregnant women, for example. I'd say it's a personal decision, but I don't know of any biological reason that you should be at higher risk. That doesn't mean I'm telling you to go and do it, because I don't give medical advice out. But I will say that I don't know, other than the risk to people who have an existing allergy that they know about to one of the components in the vaccine, I'm not aware of any other groups that should be concerned about it. If you personally don't feel great, if you're, if you're recovering from a surgery, well, then just wait until you feel better. But I don't know of any reasons biologically that you would be at higher risk for any kind of severe reaction. And the worst that can happen is if your immune system is totally shot, it may not respond as well as you'd like it to.
Right. Tara, thank you so much for your wealth of information, knowledge, and just uncanny ability to translate very complicated science into takeaways that are both nuanced and also clear.
Thanks. I love doing it. I don't know if you knew this, but I used to teach high school. So that's kind of
and you've written a bunch of children's science books, yes?
Yes. So that's kind of my bag.
We appreciate you so very much. And thank you for the time. Thank you for everyone who joined us at Medium in Conversation.
And I will point out one thing real quick.
Please.
I am wearing an antibody necklace. I just had to share that because sorry, that was it. Now we can go.
That was great. All right.
Bye.
Thank you for being with us.